Well, welcome everybody to the fourth session of the Guy Foundation Spring Series on Water. Today's lecture will be presented by Alistair Nunn, our Director of Science, and it's going to be called Origins of Life, Water, Light, Action. And today we're really pleased to welcome Bob Fosbury, Dr. Robert Fosbury, who's going to give an introductory talk. Now, Bob is honorary professor at the University College London Institute of Ophthalmology. He's also emeritus astronomer at the European Southern Observatory. And Bob worked for about 26 years at the European Space Agency on the Hubble Space Telescope. He also served with NASA and the European Space Agency scientific teams as they developed the instrument concepts for the James Webb Space Telescope. Bob's going to give us a short talk and then an introduction to Alistair. Bob, over to you.
I'll give a very brief introduction to Alistair. You guys probably know him better than I do, but I know him well enough now from the University of Westminster and the Guy Foundation. Alistair and I have discussed a number of these things, and we've kind of converged on this interest in water and light and infrared radiation and so on. I thought in my introduction to him, I would say that I think both of us are, in some sense, have a peculiar background. I mean, Alistair's had a very complicated background, both as an academic and a worker in pharmaceuticals and communications and so on. So he has a many-branched background, which I think he's bringing into coherence in order to become super radiant. I hope so anyway, even though, like all the rest of us, he's warm and wet. I just wanted to make put a few markers down about sunlight, water, and scattering for penetration into bodies and so on that may sort of lay the foundation for what Alistair is going to talk about. And I think the main point I want to make is that there is really a rather amazing congruence between sunlight, quantitatively and spectrally, with the energetics of the biosphere, which I will try and explain in basic terms. And the question that is hovering on our minds at the moment is this transfer of energy between the sun and the biosphere largely mediated by water? I think it's mediated by many processes, but water may be the most important one. And I think that's one question we'd certainly like to address. My first slide is a slide I found a very, very long time ago. And the first time I saw it, it absolutely blew my mind. The blue line is the absorption coefficient of water from X-rays to ultra low frequency radio waves, where they communicate with nuclear submarines underwater. And this huge gap in the middle where it's highly transparent, we call the water hole. And it's in a very interesting place with respect to the spectrum of sunlight. You know, the spectrum of sunlight, as you can see here, is almost slap bang in the middle of the water hole. That makes perfect sense. You know, why is water so important? I think the subtle thing here is that the infrared part of the spectrum, the solar spectrum, is rubbing up against this rapid increase in absorption in the near infrared, where you're getting the high overtones of the water vibrational bands coming into play, and to the lower overtones and so on up here. I think this is actually rather fundamental. I think the fact that the light we're getting from the sun in the near infrared is beginning to interact with water with a range of strengths of absorption coefficient. So to begin with, the absorption coefficient is very, very low, and that means that light can penetrate deeply into the body, even though we're half water. And it increases as we go to longer wavelengths. And I think this is actually very important. So I'll move off that now and look at a broader range of it's actually a narrower range of wavelengths in a bigger zoom. So we've got to have the visible spectrum on the left, and we have sunlight coming in with an effective temperature of about 5,800 kelvins. And that produces a Planck-like spectrum. It's not entirely a Planck, it's not identical with the Planck spectrum in subtle ways, which I'll explain in a moment. But that light comes in, it interacts with the biosphere in many and various ways, and it's delayed during that process because when it gets into tissue, it scatters many times, and that delays it, keeps it inside the tissue for longer. And so that keeps it around for sort of picoseconds in the body, and actually results in a buildup of photon density in the body. It's like having a lane closure on a motorway when you're all going down the motorway at 70 miles an hour, and they close a lane, and suddenly you get a traffic jam. So instead of going at 70, you're going at 1 or 0 miles an hour, and there are a lot more of you per unit area. And I think that's what happens in the body with multiple scattering and low absorption. Anyway, the light performs many, many biological functions, obviously, from photosynthesis through to various aspects of metabolism, we believe. And it can stay in the biosphere for a very, very long time, from femtoseconds through to hundreds of millions of years. So I think this delayed dissipation of sunlight in the biosphere is something very, very fundamental to do with the way life operates. And having a huge biodiversity means that the range of timescales over which the light is delayed is very, very large. So what happens in this diagram, the sunlight comes in, it's delayed for picoseconds or minutes or days or 100 million years in coal and oil and so on. And eventually it comes out as mid-infrared radiation in this 8 to 14 micron Earth's transparency window through the atmosphere into outer space. So basically we get a flow of light, we get a long broad spectrum set of delays in the dissipation of light through the biosphere, and eventually it comes out as low-grade heat entropy out into outer space. Now, the interesting thing is that we're used to looking at the spectrum of daylight in this normal plot, watts per square meter per nanometer or whatever, that almost everyone uses. For biology, I think it's much more interesting to look at it in a slightly different way. So I've plotted the solar irradiance spectrum here in black, the outside the atmosphere, this is from space, as a photon rate per unit area, per unit energy, per electron volt. If you plot it that way, the emphasis shifts into the infrared, and the Planck spectrum here at the effective temperature of the sun is the red line here. But you see there's this quite significant excess in the infrared, peaking at about 1660 nanometers. Now, this will probably not be known by the majority of biologists, but to an astrophysicist, it's grist to the mill. This is produced by the properties of the continuous absorption coefficient in the solar atmosphere, which has a minimum at 0.75 electron volts. And this minimum is produced by the properties of the H- ion, the H anion, where hydrogen in the solar atmosphere latches on to an extra electron, which comes from the ionized metals in the atmosphere. And that second electron has an affinity of 0.75 electron volts. So to the shorter wavelengths, you can dissociate the negative hydrogen ion. To the longer wavelengths, you have a different form of continuous absorption, free absorption, where electrons come into contact but don't ionize other atoms. And that means the atmosphere at this wavelength is more transparent than at most other wavelengths, or all other wavelengths, in fact. So you see deeper into the atmosphere where it's hotter, which means you radiate more energy. And so you get an extra boost of energy in the infrared at 0.75 electron volts. And I've learned fairly recently, reading the biological literature, I came across a wonderful paper, I think it was sent to me by Scott, what's his name? I've got it here somewhere. Doesn't matter. It's a fairly recent paper, but it's biology which has been known since the early 2000s and probably before, that the average action potential across all of life, to make the work, it's the action potential in terms of the Boltzmann-Arrhenius equation, is about 0.66 electron volts, which is, since they're both broad spectra, is essentially coincident with the peak radiation from the sun. And so I think the bulk of the photons entering the body, because it's at this wavelength where the body is transparent, at this wavelength, the photons around this half, three-quarters of an electron volt are available deep within the body to interact with biology. And I think this is probably very important. So just in cartoon form, we have the nuclear fusion going on in the sun and all the energy coming out at a radiation temperature of around 6,000 degrees and interacting through the atmosphere with the life forms on Earth, with plants, with fungi, with animals of all kinds. And as we shall see in a moment, not only qualitatively, but quantitatively, there's an intimate coupling between the solar atmosphere's emission and the biosphere at 1 astronomical unit from the sun. We think of the Goldilocks zone as being the zone where water can be liquid, solid, and gas simultaneously. But in fact, this is a closer Goldilocks zone where the radiation energy coming from the sun is a very close match to what we need in order to get metabolism to work properly by lifting electron transport over these barriers that it comes across in the biological process. I just wanted 3 slides I've got, 3 or 4 slides just to show you about this transparency business. One is just the spectrum of the sunlight filtering through the canopy of a tree, a tulip tree in this case. So we're sitting in shade under a tree, and this is the spectrum we measure if we look up at the canopy of the tree. And you can see this enormous excess of near-infrared radiation, which is being scattered from the leaves of the tree. The leaves they already got plenty of infrared radiation. They don't need any more for their mitochondria. So they get rid of the infrared in order to stop losing too much water from their leaves. And this comes out as this huge excess, which extends to longer wavelengths. My spectrometer doesn't go to longer wavelengths, but it extends to longer wavelengths. And that's available in the forest understory for all the other life in the understory to utilize for these various biological processes. You've seen this before, probably, my hand at 850 nanometers, just to illustrate how translucent the body is in the infrared. And you notice here, you see the veins, and as many of you will know, deoxygenated hemoglobin has a significant absorption band at around 800 nanometers, 760 nanometers or whatever it is. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's right in the middle of this near-infrared spectrum. And yet the bones are effectively transparent. They scatter light very easily. I apologize for my foot as well, just to show, but it applies for my foot as well. So we can see light getting through significant distances through the foot. And I think if you look in my foot and look at the photon density, you'll find it's really quite high because the light's been trapped in there for much longer than it would if it went straight through. This is another remarkable observation of a mushroom. This is a lion's mane mushroom, which is perfectly white. It has no pigment, no visible pigment in it at all. And yet I put it onto an incandescent light source. This is my integrating sphere, and it glows red like sunset. And look, Mum, no pigment. This is not due to pigments. This is the setting sun. And almost all of living tissue is like this in the infrared. There's very weak absorption, and light scatters many times, and the blue light scatters more strongly than the infrared light. So the infrared light gets through. This is the way the light gets into tissue. This is my simple model of cartoon model of an electron transport chain, and many of you in the audience know how this works far better than I do, so I'm not going to explain it. But I think the thing I want to point out, the electron transport in the electron transport chain happens in a number of hops. And I'm sure it does this for very good reasons, because it's hard to do it all at once. But these hops range in action potentials from, well, a few tenths of an electron volt up to 0.8 or so of an electron volt. Now, I tried to estimate how many electron transport chains there are in the body. I don't know if any one of you have tried to do this sum, but I eventually resorted to ChatGPT and looked at the way they did it, and it looked reasonable to me. So your body contains about 10 to the 21 or 10 to the 22 electron transport chains. Now, is it a coincidence that the photon rate from the sun within the transparency window of tissue is also around 10 to the 21 photons per second per whatever? So there is if you want an electron transport chain to work using energy from the solar photons to oil the wheels, so to speak, to get it across all these hops and down into the ATP synthase, you've got an almost perfect number of photons coming from the sun to give you just the amount of energy you need to get over all these barriers more easily than you would just by quantum tunneling. This is a cartoon now of this process in the electron transport chain, where we're looking at the electron transport rate. This is rather arbitrary. It's normalized at some value at the top for a normal electron transport rate change in the dark, a rate in the dark. And the contributions to get over these activation barriers of the contribution of the kinetic temperature, body temperature, 37 degrees centigrade, quantum tunneling using the standard quantum tunneling equation. But these are all the photons that get in. And you see, we have huge numbers of photons that get into the body that will allow this electron transport chain to work much faster than it would without them. And I think you can tell me I'm wrong, but I think my assessment of this is that we can do metabolism in the dark, not just because of the KT in the 37 degrees, but if you include the quantum tunneling, we can do metabolism in the dark. But as soon as we go out and sit under the sun, we can do it much more easily. There's a huge amount of energy there to contribute to that. And I'll summarize with this cartoon, which really shows two things. I have on my desk, maybe you noticed, there's a slowly rotating wheel on my desk, which is a Stirling engine, a heat engine. So the life is essentially two heat engines, one working with kinetic temperatures. Our body is 37 degrees and our surroundings are typically 20 degrees in reasonable weather, or in an office. You have a relatively small difference between your body temperature and the ambient temperature. So you have a heat engine there, which can help, which is what you need to maintain your homeostasis. But look at the sunlight coming down, doing photosynthesis, and the trees and the grass and so on. That's coming down with a radiation temperature of nearly 6,000 degrees. And you are radiating energy out into space, and that blue cone there, and the space is actually at about 270 degrees, minus 270 degrees centigrade, a few degrees above absolute zero. But you have to get through the Earth's atmosphere, which contains water vapor, and that means that if you look at the radiative temperature of a clear sky, it's typically about minus 40 or minus 50 centigrade. So if you were outside sitting under a tree in sunlight, but in the shade of sunlight, and your body can radiate heat out to a clear blue sky, your homeostasis, your kinetic temperature heat engine will work much better. And Fujian Indians will be able can produce about two or more times the useful energy than we can when we're surrounded by a high temperature like 20 degrees. So if you want people in your offices to work better, you should make the offices cold and give them clothes and get them to work under in a cold environment. And I just wanted to finish actually by saying I looked at this slide from Nathan the other day, and I just wondered whether this is one of the mechanisms that we need to get the photon energy into the biology. That is, passing charges between a charged and a non-charged entity here, where we have to feed energy in to change the orientation of the water molecules around the charged object. We have to swap them over. Nathan, I'm not explaining this very well, but you know very well what I mean. And I just wondered if this was one of the mechanisms that we perhaps have available to ourselves to do this job. Okay, well, look, I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's a fascinating thing. Okay, I'm going to try and integrate some of that, but it's going to be it's a variation on the theme here. So anyway, let's get going. To build on what we're saying, there is a kind of a hypothesis here. Did light or does light grease the biological water wheels of life? And this is obviously a reference back to Wayne and his ATPAs as well, but there's all sorts of wheels within wheels in biology. And certainly as the meeting's gone, the series of lectures we've had over the last couple of months pointed out that water has some really interesting properties, its polarity, its potential to be ordered, its conductivity, etc. But as Bob points out, it absorbs light. Now, interestingly, there is this water wind at far UV it absorbs, and red and infrared very well, but it's transparent to the visible wavelengths, including the near UV. And this could be quite important because we're going to have a little think about the origins of life here as well. And this extends actually, and this is something that goes just beyond Earth, but out into the universe really. About it's important, but water is also really important here. And this is something I've learned in the last few weeks trying to write this talk. It may provide some insight into how it all started. So, as Bob pointed out, we live in a Goldilocks zone, and we can also look at this from the life's point of view, that life evolved on this planet in the conditions that existed when it started and as it is now. And so we're very much evolved to work in a certain Goldilocks zone. And of course, as most of you probably know about Goldilocks, she visited the 3 bears and discovered there's a hot, cold, and medium porridge and went for the medium one. But certainly life seems to live in this kind of a Goldilocks zone, and according to conditions, where water seems to play a really important role. Today, what I'm going to talk about, I'll do something on the origins of life, a bit on light, a bit on electricity, because I think it's all related, something on water, obviously, some history and how this all came together, and support for one origins theory in particular, which we'll end on. And I'll mention peanut butter at the end, and someone remind me about peanut butter, which is it's quite an interesting corollary to all of this. So let's have a look at the origins of life. And I've started this, and this is actually interesting because this kind of almost compares with what Bob was calculating from his chatbot, from the chatbot. Life is fundamentally electrical. We're all sitting here burning through 80 to 100 watts, and a lot of this is happening inside of mitochondria. Now, I've made a calculation that we've got something like 10 quadrillion mitochondria in most of us. But what's important is they're channeling billions and billions and billions of electrons per second. And I think your answer about how many electron transport chains, Bob, I think is probably not far off. So we're electrical beings, because all these electrons are being used to generate a huge proton gradient and other ion gradients, which reaches 10 million volts per meter. And what's interesting, of course, is that pure water is not that conductive. But as soon as you put ions in it, off it goes. It's really conductive. And I think this is a really important thing. So we're flowing charge at a huge rate. And if we think of origins of life, we may need to consider this, because I think this could be telling us something quite important. Just to go through some of the theories of life, I won't go into detail most of them, but there's the RNA world theory. This is where nucleotides came first. They contained information. They could do catalysis. This originated because, of course, a lot of the biochemistry in the galaxy generates these kind of molecules. There's the fatty acid world. There's also the alkaline thermal vent world, which we'll talk about more. And this is the idea of metabolism first, but also talks about the water world hypothesis, which are kind of two things are interrelated. There's also the purple Earth. Now, I hadn't heard of this one, and this is where the precursors to rhodopsin, which is important in vision, isoprenoids, can actually create proton gradients from light. And there's a theory that this could have been important. There's also UV-driven hypotheses ranging from fundamental kind of biochemistry in the seas to actually zinc sulfide compounds in the Earth's mantle generating proton gradients. But there's proton first, there's polymers, there's warm soups ponds, obviously, and there's a panspermia idea. And of course, I throw in Star Trek here because this is obviously an interesting one. But of course, all it does is put the problem somewhere else. So whether that's true or not, we have to work on. But there's also something which I found quite recently, and there's this idea of the water paradox theory. And this is that water on its own is actually too damaging because of the way it stresses molecules like DNA. And this suggests that actually dry wet cycles on land were key. And I'll answer this question a bit later because it led to the hot spring theory. This is another land-based theory. Now, what's really fascinating here is that when we started to look into life starter molecules, as I like to call them, the basic chemistry and physics in stars, interstellar gas clouds, and I'm sure Bob will be familiar with this, and planetary disks, produces most of the starter chemicals for life. It's already out there in the universe. And what's really important in this, of course, is related to heat and light and protection from light in many cases and interaction with radiation. So the surprise really is that just the universe produces just about everything we need to start life. And from this, there's some rather interesting outcomes. One of them is that people have been looking to how some of these molecules evolved. And there's actually a theory, and I don't know how accurate this is, but that ATP, the energy currency in the cell, could actually be produced in volcanoes. Now, I don't know how much merit this has, but if it has some merit, it's interesting. But what is particularly interesting, and this is something I've only become recently aware of, is that ATP is hydrotropic. And this is it can help solvation of proteins. So it has a completely different function than simply carrying energy. And so this is there's an interesting interaction going on between water and ATP. And these are just some of the papers suggesting how many chemicals there are out there. But of course, there's always the question I've always asked when we're thinking about origins of life. It's all very well having all the chemistry, but how do you organize it? And this, of course, this comes from the idea of far from equilibrium, self-organizing, dissipating structures, and the idea of adaptive thermodynamics, as sort of first promulgated by Ilya Prigogine, basically suggesting that if you have an energy gradient in molecules, thermodynamics dictates that these will organize to dissipate that energy potential. And certainly we see this in the formation, for instance, of structures like hurricanes, because here we have a large energy gradient and we end up with a structure which dissipates the energy. Of course, this led to the idea that basically life is a negative piece of negative entropy. It organizes to dissipate energy and leads the universe towards a heat death. That has very philosophical underpinnings, which I won't go into today. But nature hates potential. But of course, it needs to flow in something. And this is one of these water is one of these compounds. So are we missing anything about these theories? Well, we've certainly got the boiling pot of all the chemical starters, in particular those involved in redox and electron transport. We have some good thermodynamic organization theories. We also have some good replication informational theories, and these branch of thermodynamics, including the cycle of Brillouin. I'm not going to go into those because I don't fully understand them, but they all suggest that this is all possible. We also have natural selection. Now, this is a fascinating topic because everybody talks about this in relation to Darwin, but I discovered the other day that Stephen Hawking talked about this on the origins of the universe, and the idea that right at the beginning, natural selection was an important process. So Darwin would have understood this. And we also have the potential energy, loads of geothermal, we have solar, and of course we have water. A question which Jimmy and I are asking each other at the moment is, of course, what is life's boundary? Life seems to need a boundary from self, from non-self. Did it require something to shape it? Now, did it require, for instance, a cavity in like a crystalline cavity somewhere, or did it need a membrane vesicle? Which we know these things form spontaneously within fatty acids in solution. Did it require a clay surface? Did it require charge or a field, an electric field to start? It also required something to flow in. Of course, brings us back to water again. And did it need something to manage the light? Because light clearly is an energy input which could damage it too. So it needed to manage that. So we end up with a kind of a cupboard full of things which perhaps haven't always been used in origins of life theories. Certainly electricity and fields are coming to the fore, I think. Photons, we know that they in chemistry, but do they need on a daily basis in life? Other things we won't go into today is gravity and magnetism, but these may be important, and clearly the water. So let's try and put this in some historical context, and I'm sure you will recognize these as red onions. It's been known or suggested for a very long time, or certainly the last 250 years, that life is electrical, and this goes back to Galvani and his frog's legs. But this led to thinking, certainly in the late 19th and early 20th century, that the shape of life must have involved something called a morphogenetic field. And because this was before anybody really knew about DNA, they knew inheritance was there, but what was actually causing, why was a frog's leg a frog's leg? Why was a giraffe? And how did you regenerate when you were injured? And this led to folk like Alexander Gurwitch investigating this. And of course, this led to his famous onion experiment. Why he did it, I'm not entirely sure, but he decided to cut an onion root and showed that actually it seemed to be generating a form of radiation which stimulated growth in another onion root. And this seemed to be ultraviolet light. But of course, this gave birth to all sorts of ideas. And this gave birth to the idea, of course, clearly that photons are important, but also that bioelectricity might be important. And I kind of think it's interesting when you start going through the history, see lots of people have been making allusions to water. And Strentz Gorney, who gave the famous quote, "Life is nothing but electron looking for a place to rest," apparently also said, "Water is life's matter and matrix, mother and medium," suggesting it was very important. And certainly thinking of the legacy of Gurwitch, of course, we've got the ideas involving biophotons and non-chemical communication, and it's photobiology, but this led also to development theories around bioelectromagnetics. And there's certainly famous researchers in the past and present looking into this now. And as most of us on the quantum biology meeting, there's a growing acceptance that fields are really important in life. We certainly put our 4 penneth worth in here, and we tried to explain the origins of morphogenetic fields, certainly by this idea that if we thought about a thermal vent, one of the things that happens in a thermal vent is you've got upwelling of fundamental particles, hydrogen, etc. And this, of course, generates charge and an electric field. And maybe this electric field could have been important in generating shape and form. Now, sorry, the diagrams aren't particularly brilliant, but we certainly, these things like cytoskeletons could have been very important. Now, of course, everybody said, oh, well, bacteria don't have cytoskeletons, but we're now understanding that archaea, another kingdom of prokaryote, do have a form of cytoskeleton. It could be very, very ancient. I'm sure Philip Curran was probably interested in this, but of course, when we start putting all these things together, electric fields and potentially membranes, we start to have something which has a boundary between self and non-self. And this could, of course, contain information. And this leads on to the work and then modern life, and certainly the experimentation that Mike Levine's doing with planaria. Now, is there a smoking gun? Well, certainly for the dissipation hypothesis, well, I would say there is, because one of the first things you learn in biology about mitochondria is they do something really weird. They uncouple. And as you dig into this, you realize that biochemistry is actually very inefficient in many ways. It's futile cycles. And by that, it means only a relatively small component of the energy is used to do work. A lot of it is simply released as heat, i.e. the cell is ticking over all the time, producing lots and lots of heat. And some say this has been a mechanism to control redox, and here we have a membrane, so here we have electron transport chain producing protons, and you uncouple it, you basically short circuit it. And this is very important, certainly in biology, to control oxidative stress, because if the membrane gets too charged, it can produce lots and lots of ROS. So this mechanism seems to be very important, but it's also important in generating heat. This is certainly something which is very real. Others also suggest, and this again is important when you think biochemically, everything in your cell moves around, is basically charged and relies on a form of electrophoresis to move around. I.e., if you've got charge through a cell with energy, you can move proteins which are charged. And this is something which is actually very important in everyday biology. And we know that controlling this, say, uncoupling with factors and indeed plant compounds can reduce the oxidative stress, and it's indeed been shown to be anti-inflammatory. And I would just simply say that this, of course, is a dissipating mechanism to main structure. If you're flowing energy all the time, dissipating it, this is a way of keeping your structure going. Well, it's water energy. Of course, what about photons and self-organization? You can kind of apply the same thing again. Certainly, as we said, interstellar chemistry leads to all sorts of photoreactive molecules. These can undergo autocatalytic cascades driven by light, and they can form systems which retain information. Now, what's really quite interesting, of course, is as soon as we look back through biology, go back to ancient biology, one of the big challenges, certainly to early life, was light. Too much UV was a real problem, and I'll come back to that. But what we know is very early in evolution, prokaryotes were developing sunscreens, effectively molecules which could absorb and dissipate light energy. And if you go forward 3 or 4 billion years, we come to modern life, and these compounds, or the sort of grandchildren of these compounds, are still present today, and they have multiple functions. And one of the reasons we got into a lot of this, because we used to work on cannabis, We were looking at cannabidiol. Now, cannabidiol, as you probably all know, is all over the internet and everybody thinks it's wonderful, a great compound, but nobody has a clue how it really works. And we know it's anti-inflammatory, we know it's anti-cancer, it has lots of interesting things, anti-epileptic, obviously, as Geoffrey will say. But one of the ways you can look at this is we also know that actually these compounds in plants probably started life as sunscreens, and indeed cannabidiol is fluorescent, it absorbs in the UV, but it's also very lipophilic, and so it dissolves in membranes. Now, one of the most fundamental components of a cell is its membrane, and maintaining the fluidity of a membrane is absolutely essential for function. I mean, if you look into the biochemistry, it's horrendously complicated, but biology operates in a very narrow band of fluidity. If your membranes get too fluid, they just don't work. If they get too stiff, they don't work. So there's like a Goldilocks zone of fluidity. And so the possibility exists that these compounds have evolved through time to be incorporated in stress resistance. And we suggested in a paper that what these compounds actually do is maintain membrane fluidity, because they're antioxidant too, so they can control oxidation in membranes. And if they reflect light too, well, this could all be part of a thing. So kind of think sunscreen. So, okay, sunscreens. Okay, well, yeah, that means it's great looking at cannabidiol, but what about other things? Well, the cell is packed full of chromophores, and this is a point we keep making. And this is the absorbance spectrum of several of the most important chromophores in the cell, ranging from amino acids like tryptophan to the flavins. NADH is clearly one, pyridoxines, lipopigments, porphyrins. And they all absorb light and can emit light through fluorescence. Now, what I find really interesting is all these overlap. So what if one compound absorbs one energy and then releases a longer wave photons, which is absorbed by another compound, and so on? Here you have a dissipating structure, which is fundamental electron transport chain. Is this just serendipity? I don't, we don't really know yet. But what is certainly true is when we start to look at compounds in plants, and this is maybe familiar to some of this salicylic acid, which is basically a very important plant hormone, but it also is a very good sunscreen, especially if attached to a polymer, and it also uncouples. It does all of these things. It's quite amazing. And in fact, most of you will probably had this on your skin because this was used to be used in a lot of sunscreens. And we made a suggestion right at the beginning, many years ago, that NADH, for instance, could be a sunscreen because it absorbs a lot of light. Could this tell us how one of its fundamental properties when life started? These are just some of the other molecules which are involved, and they all share this, or a lot of them share this aromatic structure. But DNA in particular is interesting because, of course, everybody says, well, it's just a molecule which is used in storing information. But actually, it has some interesting photonic properties. But one of them is a good sunscreen. And indeed, bacteria seem to use it as a sunscreen. And if you have a biofilm which is exposed to a lot of sunlight, the top layer of bacteria will actually commit suicide and release the DNA as a sunscreen. Kind of tells you that it has more than one function. And these are just some of these other molecules we all know about today, ranging from resveratrol, quercetin, berberine, curcumin, all are cannabinoids. But these all can act as sunscreen, but they can also alter mitochondrial function. This is energetic sunlight. I think this is kind of tells us something. But of course, all of us are all very familiar, and we're all trying to look at this now, of course, biophotons. And does this mean that if metabolism is producing very low levels of light, is this part of a photonic homeostatic system? It's not a new idea, but it's an idea which I think is beginning to build. We're all familiar with this idea, but of course it's very difficult to see it. We're trying to look at it we're trying to look at this. We are seeing biophotons at very low levels. Are there more inside a cell? This is a big question. We don't actually know at the moment, but clearly what is important, these photons are generated, or apparently generated, through oxidative stress, which of course is related to the flow of electrons. And what's interesting about these is that they seem to be covering a broad range of wavelengths, right from the UV all the way to the infrared. So when did this arrive in evolution? Did this happen right at the beginning, or was it something that came along later? We're also very familiar with red and infrared light. I won't go through this again, so we're all familiar with the idea that red light, and certainly near infrared light and infrared light, certainly has therapeutic properties. This seems to be pretty well established now, ranging from controlling inflammation in the brain after injury to reducing glucose. And it's clear that there's probably many more applications here, but we still don't fully sure how it actually does it. As Bob suggested, we might know why, but how is an interesting word. But before we go on a bit further, I just want to take you back to some more established science and just give you a different story. Most of you will know about melatonin and this important hormone in the brain, which actually is suppressed by blue light, and this is why we get jet lag and everything. But actually, melatonin is an ancient molecule. Not only does it absorb light, so it could have been a sunscreen, it's also a very powerful antioxidant. And what is less known is if you exercise, you induce the amount of melatonin, so that probably helps you sleep. But actually, most of your melatonin reduction happens in and around mitochondria and somatic cells. And indeed, there is evidence that NIR might actually induce its production. And so this does suggest actually it has a much more ancient role in metabolism, relating light and control of infrared light. How it's being produced by infrared light, I think, needs to be a little established. But certainly, here we have again an ancient sunscreen molecule, if you like to call it that, which is potentially absolutely important everyday metabolism in modern life. To take this a step further, probably all familiar with vitamin D too. And again, in textbooks, this is this really important vitamin which you generate in sunlight. Now, of course, we're all very familiar with the slip, slap, slop and wear your sunscreen kind of thing. But actually, what we know about vitamin D is that's doing an awful lot more. It's also doing things like controlling mitochondrial health. But there's a very interesting Goldilocks zone here in terms of what happens when we're exposed to sun. Now, of course, we're all familiar with skin cancer and the dangers of that. But there was a very interesting paper published by Lindquist in 2016 where they looked at sun exposure in Sweden. And what they actually found was that mortality was inversely related to sun exposure. And the point they made was, although if you're exposed to more sun, you tended to get more skin cancer, people tended to live longer. And one of the factors that they were living longer was apparently they got less heart disease, suggesting that there is actually this Goldilocks zone of sunlight exposure, in particular in northern populations. And of course, when you look at vitamin D, what is it? Well, it's based on cholesterol, which is a sunscreen. It absorbs light at certain frequencies. So there's more going on here than meets the eye. And certainly, it's not just about the vitamin D. We're now finding there's other things going on with UV light generating, for instance, nitrates in the skin, which can reduce blood pressure. So there's a lot more science to be done here. Could this be an echo of the beginning? So really, we now start to need to think about a bit. We call this quantum hormesis. Now, most of you are familiar with hormesis. This is the idea that small amounts of stress induce adaptation, too much cause damage. It's fundamental to evolution. And as we suggested, complex life has obviously evolved sunscreens. Early in life, it was much more of a problem if you're a bacterium because UV was very, very powerful. But if you look at the depth of penetration of light in modern organisms, certainly in complex life, it doesn't, UV goes very short distances, blocked mostly by the skin. As you go longer and longer wavelengths, it goes further. And as Bob pointed out, it can go in and wander around inside our tissues at infrared light. And what's interesting, and I'm still trying to find more data from this, but there's some evidence that infrared light actually can suppress damage done by UV almost immediately. Now, there's some theories here, and maybe Nathan at some point can explain this to me. There's this thing called reverse intersystem crossing, and the red light may be inducing this, reducing the damage potentially caused by UV in triplets. But the other side to this, and this is really important, the hormesis, and this is why coming back to a little bit what we were interested in, is that, of course, too much NIR and infrared is actually dangerous. And if you talk to any plastic surgeons and people who've been exposed to have lots of red light, people standing in front of furnaces and red fires, they get a lot of damage from too much red light. So there's clearly a U-shaped curve here. And certainly if we go back to looking at our electron transport, and we can when we know very clearly, for instance, complex 1 electron transport chain is modified by blue and UV light, complex 3 by green light, and of course cytochrome C oxidase, which we'll talk about in a minute, is also modulated by red and infrared. And this suggests something. But all of these will produce ROS in a biphasic fashion, depending on dose. Which kind of leaves us with this point. When we start to think about life, we may need to think about the production of life, photons by life itself, and how that interacts with chromophores, and suggesting this is part of a dissipating structure to dissipate from high energy to low energy photons. But of course, we're really interested in water here. Now, water is not a spectator. Now, this again, if those of you who did biochemistry, we told that water is just a solvent. That's all it does, and biochemistry happens in water. Well, yeah, right. Let's reset this a bit. It's not just important for life, and this is something that Bob maybe helped me with. But of course, it's key apparently in stellar evolution and planetary formation. It has far more of a role in the universe than people perhaps made out. It is absolutely everywhere. And there's even suggestions it was there right off the Big Bang. It was created straight at the beginning. And certainly there's evidence now that in stellar disks and other planetary systems, there's certainly water being generated. And there's even suggestions the Earth actually contains more water than we see in the oceans. I don't know how they managed to get this calculation, but there's some suggestion that it is. But what's certainly the case is if we import bits of asteroid, we find brine, water, and amino acids all mixed together from asteroid samples, if these indeed are uncontaminated. But this seems to be true. And this is a fascinating take view on life. Water is by Frankel Pinter, which makes the point. Water is involved in every biochemical reaction. And in fact, you can't really distinguish it from the biochemistry. Water is the system. And we all talk about, this is the chemistry of, that this is the citric acid cycle, TCA cycle. But at virtually every step, water is involved in some component of the metabolism. And within this paper, I found a lovely quote, and this is from Mehet Ildian. Water is the most perfect traveler, because when it travels, it becomes the path itself. And I kind of think that says everything. So just to recap, go back to the physics again, we know water is polar, there's water order, there's interfacial water, which is really important, especially near charged surfaces, clearly important in ion and proton transport, potentially with quantum mechanisms. It absorbs light. I think this is but it's quite selective, as Bob pointed out. It's conductive when it's got ions in it, and that's important in electrophoresis. It helps in overcoming energy barriers, certainly important in protein folding and interacting with membranes. And of course, it has thermal properties. Now, some of you may be aware of this, and this is this idea of exclusion water. And this is Gerald Pollack's idea, is that if you look at a charged membrane, you seem to get this zone of water which is quite charged and pushes out molecules. And then this is how we got still bulk water and more ordered water. How real this is, I'm not sure. They seem to think it's real, but certainly it seems it derives its energy from infrared light. Now, I have yet to see more experiments on this. But what we do know that this, what we call non-bulk water, does exist, and this is a very recent paper by Lang. They've used Raman spectroscopy to show that around structures in cells, in particular proteins, there is this layer of water, which is quite ordered, 1 or 2 molecules thick. So clearly there is this order going on near charge, which kind of has been predicted. But of course, this leads into a very interesting question. Now, a lot of us who are interested in red light therapy will be going, oh yes, well, it's all about cytochrome C oxidase. But of course, we have to consider Andre Sommer's idea. And it's not actually to do with the absorption of light on cytochrome C oxidase, but more to do with water. And some of the reasoning is actually quite interesting. If red light is, say, inducing this benefit in mitochondria by binding to cytochrome C oxidase, you would expect a hormetic effect, in the sense that too much could be quite damaging, because obviously it would stop the cytochrome C function. What we actually see, and the evidence is that most red light seems to, and certainly in conditions where there's slight dyshomeostasis, you get an upregulation of ATP production. So which is kind of opposite what we see. But what is very interesting is, of course, that interfacial water seems to be more viscous. And the theory here is if we take the water absorption, it could reduce its viscosity. So the idea here is that actually what we're seeing, and this goes back to greasing the wheels idea, is that actually, and this is what we're seeing, is that you get a change in the water boundary and energy, enabling electrons, for instance, to tunnel or go more quickly between different components of cytochrome C. But really interestingly, of course, does this grease the wheels of ATPase? If light interacts here, do you alter the viscosity of water? Now, I think I call this M-FET accompli because, of course, this is mitochondrial field transistors. So this is kind of what Summer talks about. Now, this gets really interesting, and I came across this paper yesterday. And what we know is that if we look inside the mitochondria and their matrix, the water is very viscous. It's all mixed up with all sorts of charges and oxidation problems. Let's go back to melatonin. Melatonin is very good at reducing viscosity, and a lot of this is due to the fact that it can reduce oxidation. And we know that if you have free radicals, it starts to cause things to come stiffer, including membranes, but apparently also water. And this group are suggesting that actually things like dementia and the treatment with red light actually stops the production of precipitates of, say, things like amyloid. And this is because it's actually making the water less viscous. And this enables the mitochondria to work faster and better, produce more ATP. And if you remember, I mentioned this idea that ATP may be hydrotropic. Well, what this suggests is that once you start producing ATP, you can make everything a little bit more greased, a little more viscous. ATP is actually acting like a bit like an engine oil. If this is true, and infrared light is helping this process, here we have a very ancient partnership where melatonin, water, and light go back 3 or 4 billion years, where they're controlling this antioxidants and viscosity. And the way it's described, of course, is this could be controlling phase separation and condensation. Now, we've got time to go into protein condensation, but this could be quite important. And this is a positive feedback loop. I'll refer to this paper by Lone Ridge. It's really interesting. So this brings us, coming towards the end here, this brings us to an idea about a hypothesis. Now, when we think about it, there's 2 ways we can think of, if we think about entropy, is of course there's dissipation of solar potential, but there's also dissipation of geothermal potential. And both of these are being thought of in terms of the origins of life. So we talk about the sea surface, we talk about ponds with alternate cycles of wet and dry, thermal vents on land, thermal vents in deep sea, thermal vents near the sea surface. Well, let's have a look. Well, one thing is actually quite important here, and this is UV. Now, we all talk about UV being so important in stellar chemistry, and certainly in chemistry on the Earth, but it's actually very damaging. And the suggestions are, and I don't know how accurate these are, but they seem to suggest that on the early Earth, there was much more UV around. This was because the sun was perhaps producing a bit more, but there was no blocking of the effect on the early atmosphere. And this is from a draftsman paper from Nussin, and suggests that in the early Archean, UV levels, especially in shorter wavelengths, were very high indeed. And that's suspicious to me, because when you look at what we got today, and they actually mentioned Mars here, it's much less. Now, what's really interesting is when you start to think how far UV penetrates into water. Now, short wavelength UV doesn't penetrate that far. As you go up the wavelength, it goes further and further and further. And this suggests something. If we actually look at sea, and we look at seawater and how far the spectrum of light goes into water, what we see is infrared stops right at the surface. This is why the surface, I think all of you have probably gone swimming in the sea on a hot day and have a lovely warm water, and until you put your feet down, it gets really cold. Well, the top layer of water absorbs a lot of the energy. But as you go towards the shorter wavelengths, green and blue, it penetrates much, much further into the sea. And this is why we see the colors we do. Interestingly, UV goes in quite a long way. So does this suggest that that on the surface of the Earth, especially the early Earth, was there just too much UV? There've been plenty of infrared, but too much UV. And as Bob will testify in physics, we'll talk about, water absorbs, and a lot of this is because it can absorb, and it gets this bond wobbling going on. And I just love this thing, stretch, wobble, bend, liberate. It's this idea of how water absorbs the energy. But of course, it's dissipating this energy, which of course can generate heat, which we know in hot and warm seawater. So does this help in conventional classical catalysis by simply warming things up a bit, or by some quantum resonance, for instance, by the ENAC method, environmentally activated quantum transport? There's all sorts of ways this could be looked at. So just to summarize the story so far, UV light may be too intense on light for early Earth surface, the first billion years or so. But yet UV clearly played a role in the chemistry, maybe for instance, inducing stress-induced evolution, for instance, of sunscreens. Red and infrared light would have been plentiful, but would not have penetrated very far into the ocean. If we accept these limits, this leaves 2 options. And I throw in here, I can't pronounce this is a field near Iceland. And this is a discussion I've actually had with Nick Lane. And these are thermal vents which exist very near to the surface of the sea. Now, if you start to think about this is quite fascinating, because these thermal vents are actually within the range of light, but only certain wavelengths. If we think about blue and UV, they are certainly in range of UV light, certainly blue and green. But when you go to longer wavelengths, no, they're not. And certainly infrared, you're not. And these vents have all sorts of interesting structures. They have the crystalline structures. They do a lot of the things that thermal vents in deeper seas do. Not everything, but some of it. Could these have existed in the early Earth? We don't know. It would be fascinating if they did. But the other alternative is, of course, our deep sea thermal vents. Now, not all of you will know this, but deep sea thermal vents glow. They emit a lot of light, particularly in the infrared and red. So if we go through the checklist, we go, well, they have a porous crystalline structure. Yep. They have the basic ingredients. Yep. Hydrogen and carbon dioxide and basic amino acids. Autocatalytic dissipating structures. Yes, we know these can start to evolve in these, and this is what Nick Lane's looking at. Certainly explains the proton gradient. Energy supply, plenty of geothermal energy. Water, plenty of, obviously. Important ions, yes, magnesium, calcium exist. Charge flow, yes, they do. Obviously, they got the charge. And critically, they also have a changing in distance to force evolution. Check movement tectonic plates. So these things evolve, provided conditions where life was, if the life did start there, was under constant stress. And it's been suggested this is in fact where photosynthesis started, based on this thermal vent glowing. So this kind of raises a thought. Is the metabolism we see today generating its own light as a kind of feedback mechanism? And suggesting that metabolism at IR, as Bob was suggesting, could be very, very tightly linked together. And does it reflect life's beginnings? Now, what's quite interesting here is, we often think about thermal energy, and but the thing is, all biological life dissipates energy by definition. So even organisms that are apparently unable to maintain their own body temperatures, and you think of big animals, the membranes and the water near them are going to be exposed to heat, because if you've got a flow of, if you've got an inefficient system, throwing electrons and protons and ions through it, you're generating energy and heat. So water is very good at absorbing these longer wave photons. Does it have anything to do with generating? I don't know. I couldn't find any data, and this is a question I asked Bob. But certainly, is there such thing as delayed luminescence here? And I don't know whether this, again, the physics, but we certainly know that organic compounds, you can have this process called delayed luminescence, thermally induced delayed luminescence. Can we separate this from black body? And now, if we look at the black body radiation, I think all the physicists will be very familiar with this. The hotter something is, you see a spectrum of light emitted from a black body. So obviously stellar stuff is up here somewhere, but we're back down here at 310 degrees Kelvin, sorry. We're looking at biological samples, and this is where a lot of humans emit thermal radiation in the 7 or 8, 9 micron wavelengths. Of course, this is what they use in infrared cameras to detect people and find life. So how does this range, and how does this range with the water here? So the bridge is up here somewhere. And there's a big question here. What is the actual spectrum of light being produced at a charged membrane dissipating energy? I don't think it may be very difficult to measure. The other thing I'll throw in here, of course, is the word from Christian, is that all biological processes produce heat, but the prize has to go to old mitochondria. They are little furnaces, and if the evidence is correct, they are operating at much warmer temperatures than the surrounding cell. This seems to have been proved, but we're still not entirely sure how they're managing to do this. But we know that this certainly must be going on, because obviously they can generate heat, and we know that heat has a very powerful effect on how the nucleus works. But there's a big question here: how is this heat exported? Is it diffusion, radiation, convection? There's a lovely review by Mackerel that talks about this, and it's actually still not fully understood. But we do know thermal energy can be converted into electromagnetic radiation by dipole oscillation, fundamental particles. What function does it have, if any, in all of this? And I think this is a really good question about how is this heat being radiated. So what conclusions do we have? Well, water is essential for stellar evolution chemistry, so we have to think much further back in evolution. Interaction with water with light seems to be essential. Water essential in the movement of charge and generation of fields. Water likely essential for the complex self-organization to occur in energy gradients. Without water, we couldn't, maybe we couldn't self-organize. Water is a component of biochemistry, it's not just a solvent. Alkaline thermal vents seem to be perhaps one of the strongest forerunners. And this is to do with the fact that you can combine all the things like charge, movement of electrons, electric field, chemistry, all together in the same place. Even the crystalline structure could be important. What's critical about life, of course, the system we call life, which is this dissipating system, is actually quite robust and can withstand quite a lot of external variations in factors, although it may be dependent on the optimal function. The robustness, which is interesting in biology, can be defined as the informational capacity to provide a series of solutions through natural selection to provide the optimal response. Darwin would have understood this. Within an organism, this comes back to thermodynamics. We can see that systems are selected for the survival of systems and natural selection of those systems that help us resolve, for instance, inflammation. But at the level of life, those that don't can work, for instance, species, because you get hit by an asteroid, you see evolution working very quickly to find those that do work. So most organisms can actually cope with a variation in symptoms, with variation in environment. So some water loss, lack of visible light. There's an interesting question here. Do deep sea creatures generate their own metabolism? And what are they doing with that? Too much light, plants in particular, have to deal with this. changes in magnetic fields, but certainly variations in energy supply. What we cannot cope with, and life doesn't seem to cope with very well, is if where electron-proton flow is inhibited. And I think this is actually critical in telling us what life is. If you disrupt protein structure too much, life just stops dead because you can't flow any electrons. And this is caused obviously by temperature extremes and excessive radiation. Lack of electron acceptors, certainly for complex life, take away the oxygen, it all grinds to a halt very quickly. We've looked at this just as an example, and we call this the metabolic flight envelope, and we talked about this briefly in our space talks. But all life seems to have its own, like what we call a metabolic flight envelope. It's evolved to work in a certain set of conditions. For instance, humans can't breathe in space or survive in space, or we can't survive in the water, but we can survive in a mix of other environments. And we know that if we take it out of environment, we become more stressed, and we result in oxidative stress. And this seems to accelerate the aging process. And just another way of looking at this, we evolved over here. Everything was fairly normal, gravity, light spectrum. So again, there's radiation, obviously food and everything. So in space, of course, this is very, very different. And it seems that this generates a system which is trying to adapt, but can't very well. And this becomes important when we start to think about stresses in space. Now, the ones we talk about certainly is that maybe microgravity was perhaps the most important of all, because we lose a stimulus for mitochondrial reserve, and something we'll talk about in another talk. But certainly radiation is damaging hypoxia, wrong carbon dioxide levels, hypermagnetic fields, which we talked a lot about already in different talks. Red light, again, this is something that Bob was suggested, that infrared starvation could be really important, in particular because these other things aren't right. This could be really important, and circadian rhythms. And we've been talking to Massimo about plants and hypermagnetic fields. Plants may be quite different. This is a really interesting, but again, that's for another talk, and then maybe Norman can talk on this one. On Earth, a lack of movement is seen to be causing a problem because we don't get enough stimulus to the mitochondrial function. Red and infrared light, potentially quite important here. Circadian, definitely. Other things, less important because we live actually on the surface of the Earth. And just to kind of review what Bob was talking about, I think that what animals and plants rely on is slightly different because of their different functions. Maybe plants are a bit more tolerant to variations in light than we are, and they've evolved systems to control, for instance, photonic-induced viscosity for instance, in their mitochondria. Whereas animals are perhaps not quite as robust to this, and so they have slightly different sort of Goldilocks zones. And we have to ask the question: is why do plants scatter so much NIR? Is this, as Bob suggests, is it too much? It's going to be a bad thing, whereas animals tend to perhaps need it. And this kind of brings up a really interesting point, and I made this in a talk the other day. We can view vitamins as being components of the diet, for instance, which are essential to help us live healthily. Take them away from a while and we still work, but not as well. I wonder if light falls into this, and we have this thing called a vitaphonon. I've suggested this idea that you have light energy, which is discrete, which is a quantum of energy, which helps lights function, perhaps for the reasons that Bob was talking about. What's really interesting here, of course, most vitamins, and these are vitamins here, absorb photons. And these were around before life started, or variations on. So, we talk about these things as being cofactors, but they're actually prefactors. They existed before complex life came along. Many dissolve, or most dissolve in water, and water absorbs photons. So is red light infrared light? Now, this is a fundamental question. Is it a stimulus or a vitaphonon? We know that life contains multiple chromophores for many wavelengths, many of them. We know that lower doses generally stimulate mild adaptation, where what too much actually causes damage, and this is the hormetic idea. Biology is actually evolved to be resistant to changes in these to some degree. This is, as we suggested, by the metabolic flight envelope. We're actually quite robust in many ways. But hormesis itself can be argued is based on adaptive thermodynamics, selection of the fittest system. And it's likely that we have evolved to be dependent on a mild amount of stress. And this is a system that causes slight disruption to the system in an energy gradient, and we've evolved to adapt to that and rely on it a bit. So although we can do without light, we do need some of it. Water is polar and exhibits hydrogen bonding and absorbs particularly well in the IR, which could be, by imparting energy, will alter its structure, particularly around charge surge, which alters its properties. This in a way can be seen as a kind of hormetic challenge. And what's very interesting about these, and this comes back to the therapy idea, of course, stress resistance in biology, the underlying system has many pathways in common. So for instance, if you exercise, you upregulate your ability to resist, say, for instance, then there's some evidence of this, say, radiation, but also resistance to infections. You become metabolically slightly more robust, and this could be because you've got more mitochondria. So this would suggest that somebody who's living in optimal health, which we can define, has higher metabolic flexibility, not higher metabolic flexibility. But in someone who's ill or not very well, these factors become less challenging. The system isn't robust. And therefore, for instance, somebody exhibiting excessive inflammation, reoptimizing some of these parameters can result in better health. For instance, this is where red light tends to help people who are not in best of health. So kind of finishing here on a summary, we can kind of, and I think this is quite interesting. Before life, water, essential planetary formation, organic chemistry, which is tightly linked to energy, photons. Because water absorbs red light and infrared light, the modulation of viscosity may well have played a pivotal role. It probably also plays a role in direct chromophore activation. And is life going to be more likely around red dwarfs, planets orbiting, wet planets orbiting red dwarfs? So, and I will leave you with that. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.